Hello everyone. My name is Dr. Kaushal Shah, and here we are to discuss something about performance analysis for biology for your board exams, right? So I have a small PPT. So I'll be sharing the PPT, and in that PPT there are some points which are covered, and we'll be discussing each of them. Just a minute. Let me start sharing the screen. Okay, so let's start something about performance analysis for bio. As we know that bio paper will be 80 marks paper, 2 hours of time. But now what we are supposed to understand is what are the examiners expecting you all to write in your answers. So that is something which is very important, and that is what we are going to discuss here, right? So let's start with the first thing. One thing is very clear that each and every student must know and must be able to clearly distinguish between what is a chromosome and a chromatid, right? When I say chromosome, it is nothing but a condensed, compact structure of DNA or chromatin fibers which come together. That forms chromosome. But when this chromosome divides, with its duplicated copy, which is attached to a junction which is on a centromere, that is where we call them chromatids. Next, some important things that we should know, especially about mitosis. So let's try to understand that. Explain the stages of mitosis with the help of well-labeled diagram. So guys, you should be aware about all the different stages of mitosis, not only just the details, but along with that diagrams also, right? And they have clearly told that we should lay importance on the position and the number of chromosomes in the diagram. Means if you are talking about prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase, then if you have drawn a diagram of prophase, right, then if in that you have shown 4 chromosomes in metaphase, in anaphase, in telophase, you will have to show 4 chromosomes only. If you change the number of chromosomes, it would be considered wrong. Train students to draw labeled diagrams of the phases of mitosis in animal cell as well as plant cell. So you are supposed to study the diagrams not only of animal cell but also of plant cell. They can ask the question directly as draw diagrams of mitosis in plant cell. Then you should know that also. And instruct students to maintain number of chromosomes in the diagrams drawn for mitosis. As we discussed that point earlier, that number of chromosomes has to be constant. There has to be proper labelings for the diagram also, right? For the discussion about what are the important points while drawing a diagram, we have a separate video for that, and the details are mentioned in that. Next, explain the number of cranial and spinal nerves to the students. You should know that there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 31 pair of spinal nerves, right? Next thing important about diagram, as they have mentioned here, is advise students to practice the diagrams of stomatal apparatus and the experiment to prove that oxygen is released by green plants during the process of photosynthesis. In this PPT, we have the diagram of stomatal apparatus. So when it comes, I'll be discussing that. Next, insist upon learning the correct spellings of the biological terms with their correct meaning. Means if there is a spelling mistake, there are chances that you will lose marks. So that has to be something that we have to consider and take care of, right? Explain to the students to differentiate between placenta umbilical cord. Now that is something which is not there in your portion this year, so we can just rule out that point and we can directly go to the last point which is highlighted there, and that is neuron and nephron. Now, you should know the difference between a neuron and a nephron. Nephron is a functional unit of excretory system, right? Kidney. And similarly, if you talk about neuron, it's the functional as well as the structural unit of, I would say, nervous system. Many times students make mistake. Instead of neuron, they write nephron or vice versa. Not only that, by drawing the attention of the students to the fact that neuron is the fundamental unit of nervous system, while nephron is that of a kidney. Okay. Next is discuss in detail the concepts of osmosis. That you should know what is osmosis very well, right? It is, and whenever you mention about osmosis, you just cannot mention that it is a transfer of water or movement of water from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. No, you have to mention something about semi-permeable membrane. Without that, the definition of osmosis is not correct, right? And in that, there are two types of osmosis that you know: exosmosis, endosmosis. You should clearly know with relevant examples of plant cell being subjected to hypertonic and hypotonic solutions. Means what happens when a cell is put in a hypotonic solution, you should be aware about that. What happens when a cell is put in a hypotonic solution, you should be aware about that, right? And the difference between the natural reflexes and conditioned reflexes, giving relevant examples. Now, this is again one very important topic from nervous system, something about reflex action and the types of reflexes, natural and conditioned. Like if I talk about, you know, you blinking your eye when there is some dust particle which is entering in your eye, that's a natural reflex that you have. But hitting a shot at a proper manner, right? Or I would say applying brake when you're driving a car when someone comes in front of you, that's a conditioned reflex. So you should know the difference between both the type of reflexes. Next, something about photosynthesis chapter. So while teaching starch test in photosynthesis, emphasize on the color change in the parts of the experimental leaf. If you see the experiment, there is color change, and that is something which is very important when you deal with starch test. Apart from that, students are advised to practice the chemical equation for photosynthesis. You should know proper balanced chemical equation. In fact, you should mention chlorophyll and sunlight on the arrow also, right? That is something which is very important. Guide students that any factor tested for an experiment needs to be proved at the end. So if you test something, it has to be proved. Hence, using a mouse and plant under a bell jar cannot prove the release of oxygen during photosynthesis, right? Since oxygen cannot be tested here, instruct students to set up the experiment using twigs of hydrilla to prove the release of oxygen. You know, there are bubbles, inverted funnel experiment. So that is something that you are supposed to be very careful of. This is stomatal apparatus, a very important diagram. So if you see, whenever you make diagrams, there are certain things that you're supposed to keep in mind. One is it has to be neat. You cannot draw shabbily, then erase it, again draw shabbily, again erase it. It will look very untidy, right? The diagram has to be neat. It has to be big diagram. You cannot draw a very small diagram, right? Next, labels. Labeling is something which is very important. Then the lines that you show that label is which part of the diagram. You're not supposed to draw arrows at all. It is just plain simple lines, right? Put this particular diagram in a box and add a title to the diagram. So these are some important tips of drawing a diagram in biology. Okay, next is familiarize students with the parts and functions of urinary system. So you should know all the system, not only just urinary system, but all the systems. You should know about organs, right? The structure of organs as well as the function of each of them. Encourage students to draw neat, labeled and accurate diagrams showing all parts clearly. Explain this location of pituitary gland with the help of a suitable interactive board or something. So when it comes to endocrine system, not only just I would talk about pituitary gland, but all the glands. Many times they just give a diagram of all the different glands. You are supposed to label all the glands. That can also come, right? Interpret the differences between the two types of diabetes with respect to hormones and symptoms. Also clarify the keywords like mellitus and insipidus. I hope you guys know now that there are two types of diabetes. One is diabetes mellitus, second is diabetes insipidus, and they both are totally different, right? One is because of antidiuretic hormone, that is about diabetes insipidus that I'm talking about. And the second is because of insulin hormone, which is diabetes mellitus. Obviously, out of both of them, the most common one is diabetes mellitus, right? Okay. Next, explain to the students the difference between an organ and an organ system. You should clearly know that. If I talk about kidney, it is an organ. But if I talk about excretory system, it just doesn't include kidney. Along with that, you have ureters, urinary bladder, urethra, all these together, right? And apart from that, you should also know the organic and inorganic constituents of urine properly. So do not skip that part. And give a comparison of the 4 endocrine glands. Listen to this carefully, guys. 4 endocrine glands, their secretions, disorders caused because of hyposecretion and hypersecretion. So when it comes to endocrine system topic, you need to understand about all the 4 important glands. What are the hormones which are released? What will happen if they are released in less quantity, that is hyposecretion of that hormone, or what will happen if they are secreted in more quantity, that is hypersecretion of that hormone, right? Give a clear understanding of the structure and functions of the parts of ear as well as eye using charts, models, and interactive boards. So this is something which is very important. See, structure as well as function. I told you, any organ in our body, these are the 2 things that you should know, right? Explain the arrangement of cytons and axons. gray matter and white matter in brain and spinal cord. I hope you guys know when it comes to brain, gray matter is outside, white matter is inside. When it comes to spinal cord, it is vice versa. Gray matter is inside and white matter is outside, right? Teach the functions of sensory cells of retina, emphasizing on pigments of rods and cones and their functions in bright and dim light. So this is what I'm talking about. One, when I specifically mention about rod cells and cone cells, rods for, I would say black and white vision, and cone cells for colored visions. Not only that, the pigments which are present, rhodopsin and iodopsin, and based on that, the adaptation. We have studied the topic of dark adaptation, light adaptation. All that is something which is important. Advise students to comprehend the definitions, operative terms, and then learn. So do not rectify your definitions. Always understand the meaning of the definition and remember it so that you will memorize it well. Otherwise, there are chances that you might, skip few words in your definition and the meaning would change completely. So in short, if I tell you general things, some highlighted important things, just I'll do a quick recap. Parts of eyeball and their function is something which is very important. Difference between carb amino hemoglobin and carboxy hemoglobin. See, when it is carbon dioxide and hemoglobin, carb amino hemoglobin, right? Carboxy is carbon monoxide is the one which is there. Watson and Crick model of DNA. Parts of brain and their function. So cerebrum and their function, cerebellum function, medulla function, all that thing has to be clearly understood. All the experiments from the chapter of photosynthesis are very important. Significance of photosynthesis is again important. Number of cranial and spinal nerves, we have discussed about that. Disorders caused due to hypo as well as hyper secretion of hormones. That is something which you should be aware about, right? Next comes the diagram of stomatal apparatus, which we have discussed. And then comes the second last line, which is there, placement of cytons and axons in brain and spinal cord, as we discussed this, right? So this is something about the performance analysis video for biology. Study well. All the best, guys. Thank you so much.